hospital mortuary can't cope with the dead bodies. Many are lined up outside waiting.
In India, the death toll from the gas tragedy of Bhopal in the central state of Madhya Pradesh continues to rise relentlessly.
1,600 people died a gruesome death when gas leaked from the pesticide manufacturing plant of Union Carbide. Some people were in such torture they'd begged to have their eyes removed.
It was more than just a tragedy, it was a disaster.
It was for the first time that I witnessed such a ghastly tragedy, all happening in front of my eyes.
It was just after midnight on December the 3rd, 1984, in Bhopal, India. A cloud of poisonous gas hovered over the sleeping city. Methyl isocyanate, or MIC, was leaking from the Union Carbide factory, an American-owned pesticides plant. The city was about to become the site of the world's worst industrial disaster.
Some of the victims I saw, their eyes had just popped out. They were swollen like anything. They were red, watering eyes, frothing mouth. Some people were dying in their own body fluid.
Thousands of men, women and children were killed that night, and the lives of thousands more were ruined forever.
Here was a group of people who was moving away from their own home in an injured state, without knowing where they were going, without knowing what had hit them. They just didn't know.
Initially, Union Carbide said the leak wasn't their fault.
We believe that this occurred because of a deliberate act of a disgruntled employee. It was not an act of negligence.
But no proof of that claim was ever given. More than 2 decades later, survivors still face constant sickness, and it's not uncommon for new babies to be born with defects linked to the leak. And then there's the dying. After effects are still taking their toll at a rate of 1 a day. Meanwhile, the fight for rehabilitation, accountability, and compensation goes on.
The survivors never gave up. They are not giving up, even today. And their demands for a life of dignity and justice continue to remain uppermost in their minds.
I had just barely come home, and it must have been about 11-ish. It was cold and wintry night that day. I get this message from the control room coming in, trying to tell me that something had gone wrong at the carbide. Could have been around 12, maybe a little after 12. And I just asked him, what do you know about, what is this? He said, sir, it is said, the officer on duty in that region has said that there is some kind of gas leak which is taking place in the vicinity of the carbide. And therefore he's alerted everybody.
Most of the city was sound asleep. No one could imagine the real nightmare that was about to begin.
Suddenly, we got up. I started having a very severe pain in my eyes. They were all burning, itching. There was all watery discharge from the eyes. I thought that, you see, the gas, the LPG cylinder must have leaked. I got up and I asked my wife just to open all the windows so that the gas, if there is a leakage, would pass off. But then she was not able to get up. She was also having the same problems. She was coughing incessantly. And my son, who was sleeping close by, he was really in agony. He was coughing, crying.
The Union Carbide factory was located in the densely populated center of Bhopal. The plant had been making pesticides for years without problems, but on that night, something went horribly wrong. A faulty valve allowed water to enter the MIC storage tank. That caused an explosion and the release of a lethal gas cocktail into the Bhopal night air. Those affected worst were those living closest. the slum dwellers.
My name is Jazeera B. I live close to the Union Carbide plant. The house must be around 40 to 50 feet away. That night, we slept at around 11 p.m. I started coughing so much there was water in my eyes and it started burning. Then my husband went out and saw that people were running out of their houses and that gas was leaking out of Union Carbide. I had no idea before that there was so much poison being made in Union Carbide.
It was clear something bad was happening, but no one knew exactly what it was.
You see, this control room was all full of this gas. The entire area was full of the gas. And by that time, I was vomiting very, very acutely. And there comes an officer from the Carbide, who was an ex-army personnel, some Major Mehra. He came and met me, and he just came to tell me that the leak has stopped. So I just asked him, Major, can you tell me what was the leak? He said, I don't know. And I said, can you tell me what is the effect it will have? He said, I don't know. Then I told him, okay, please give me what is the antidote? What do I tell the doctors? What is the, how do we help the suffering population? He said, I don't know.
Whatever the cause, whatever the cure, the immediate result was chaos and death as MIC gas spread across the city. Heavier than air, it hugged the ground, trapping all in its wake.
As I was running, I was almost choking. My eyes and nose were dripping. As I reached the crossing, I felt my son's head slump on my shoulder as he became unconscious. I was very afraid, but I didn't uncover his face.
It was a horrible thing, people running. Again, that was a mob which was leaving the city. Here and there, it was very difficult to describe that hysteria. See, people, they all wanted to get out of the city. Practically, they were using all the vehicles, and somewhere on the bonnet of the and the top of the vehicles, the cars, auto rickshaws, and somewhere literally running.
With death at their doorsteps, their homes becoming gas chambers, many fled to the streets.
I saw a young mother in her night clothes being pushed with the crowd, being carried along with the crowd, but desperately trying to hold on to a young baby. I could see that the mother was kind of losing the baby from her hands. But after that, she probably went with the crowd. And I went to the affected areas, went to the hospital, came back. And it pains my heart no end when I think that I had to pick up the dead body of that child, crushed. That was the first body I picked up.
And there would be more, many more, as the gas tore through their bodies, killing people slowly and painfully. Lalit Shastri was one of the first journalists on the story. Within hours, he was at the hospital.
What I saw was the whole place was crowded. The corridors were full of victims lying everywhere. They were on the streets. They were inside the hospital building. Streams of victims were rushing in, coming in, through whatever means they were being brought in. And it was a horrendous sight to watch. And it was more than just a tragedy, it was a disaster.
Shamsad Begum was also at the hospital that night. She'd brought her 3 children there, desperate for help. One would not live through the night.
The doctors in the hospital were not taking good care. The doctors there also ran away when they came to know that it was MIC gas. Some were forced to stay, but even they didn't know what to do in the case of MIC gas. They were just giving injections and putting in glucose drips.
By noon of the day after, the terrible scope of what had happened was beginning to set in. The dead numbered in the thousands, and officials were overwhelmed.
And then it became a problem as to how do you manage so many dead bodies, because you see there is a legal process. Any unnatural death has to be dealt with in a particular way. Not only that, to add to that was the problem of disposal of the bodies. Human bodies plus animals. So that was another major crisis which we underwent after 2 days.
Official figures say around 3,000 people died in the immediate aftermath of the leak. Bhopal residents believe the real total was much higher. They said at least 7,000 shrouds were needed to cover the dead. But the devastation did not end with the dead of the first few hours. In fact, the real horror of that night was only just beginning. What happened in Bhopal on December the 3rd, 1984, shocked the world. People kept dying in the days that followed. And even more lay near death in hospital. Those who could get out of Bhopal did. But what led to this enormous catastrophe remained a mystery. A spokesman for Union Carbide said the company was as surprised as anyone.
We are shocked that this could happen in view of the fact that we have for 20 years, more or less, made and used the material which seems to be implicated.
But the company was ignoring something else. That for years critics had called on them to move away from the city to areas less vulnerable to the threat of something going wrong. So the people of Bhopal weren't convinced by Union Carbide's explanation. They demanded compensation and sued for billions of dollars.
Looking for Mr. Anderson?
And this man, Warren Anderson, Union Carbide's chairman at the time, became the most hated man in India.
We are fighting now for justice for those affected by the gas. We have lost our children. That Warren Anderson of Union Carbide should be tried in the courts of Bhopal. When we were inhaling the gas, we were thinking, who is the damned person who is in charge? And who gave the license for this poisonous factory?
In fact, when Anderson came to Bhopal soon after the disaster, he was arrested.
Can you tell us exactly who you've arrested, sir? Huh? Can you tell us exactly who you've arrested?
Mr. Gokhale, Mr. Manohar, and Mr. Anderson. These are the three names they have given us.
But custody for Anderson didn't last long, as the man who made that arrest recently recalled.
Well, he got bail because the bail was possible for him to take. The situation warranted that if we gave him bail, we gave him bail. He applied for bail and got it.
Satyanath Sarangi arrived in Bhopal the day after the disaster. He came to help for a few weeks. 23 years later, he's still here, running a free medical clinic for those affected.
We realized soon that the government had to be pressured because we knew that most of the people were poor people, among the poorest in the city. And for the government, as we know historically, as I knew historically, that these were people who would be considered expendable. And I didn't think that should be allowed to happen.
An out-of-court settlement was reached between Union Carbide and the Indian government in 1989. More than 500,000 people were awarded compensation. The sum was just over $2,000 per family. Yasmin Khan was one of those who received a check. Permanently disabled, with no use of her legs, the compensation barely covered her medical costs.
I got compensation, but it was inadequate. The money was so less that I could not be treated. The medicines are so expensive. When we go, they say I have to be operated. If I spend the money on treatment, then what will I eat?
Lawyer Satish Tiwari says the issue of compensation has been difficult, but also misunderstood.
This is the worst industrial disaster in the world. And I think the magnitude of the number of people involved for the compensation is something which is unprecedented anywhere in the legal history of the world. More than 500,000 people have been given compensation. So, see, it's very difficult to blame the judicial system for not doing its job properly.
But anger swept through the victim community. The survivors felt cheated. To them, the agreed-upon compensation didn't fit the horror they were still living through. Bhopal today, and more than 2 decades after the gas leak, the compensation is all gone. But members of a new generation of gas victims have begun their lives as unsuspecting inheritors of an ugly legacy. Jazeera B thought she'd lost her infant son that night 23 years ago. As it turned out, he survived, but only to live a life of constant challenges.
Today my son is 27 years old, but he can't earn a living. We got him married, but now we have to take care of him and his wife. He has learned some repair jobs of water coolers, but the work only lasts for 3-4 months in a year. There are thousands of children like mine. People in other cities don't marry them, saying that all the children of Bhopal are gas affected.
The abandoned Union Carbide plant still exists, and it's still destroying lives. Toxic chemicals fill the buildings, leaching into and contaminating parts of the city's water supply. It's caused disease and slow poisoning, making victims out of victims one more time.
We have about 200 people coming every day. These people have a history of gas exposure or exposure to contaminated water or both. The problems that we most commonly find are breathlessness, diminished vision, loss of appetite, very common, menstrual disorders of a whole range among women. We find people with numbness and tingling in their limbs, with brain problems in the nervous system. And then we find a whole host of mental health problems, depression, anxiety disorders, panic attacks, insomnia. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we find rising people coming with cancers, leukemia, a lot of people with leukemia.
Dow Chemicals bought Union Carbide in 2001, but it rejects any civil liability for the continuing fallout of what happened in 1984, arguing simply that the disaster was before its time. But recently, there have been suggestions of a compromise, an out-of-court settlement with the Indian government that would see Dow pay something in return for New Delhi allowing it new investment opportunities in the country, perhaps even in Bhopal. A prospect that worries those who lived through the disaster.
So we have yet to learn that before inviting such kind of companies in our country, we must ensure that the environmental issues on priority before giving them a license to operate this way.
As for Warren Anderson, some of the victims remain desperate to have him pay a different kind of price for their suffering.
He's not worth being called a man. He's not a man. If he's a man, he should come here and see how we are dying.
For so many questions to remain unanswered for more than 2 decades after Bhopal's long night of agony is something that haunts those who have suffered and those who have tried to help.
The irony was that the victims were made like culprits. So here we had victims with very few had literacy skills, very few had access to documents, and the victims were expected to prove their case. and establish that they were indeed entitled to this compensation sum.
But despite that, they're still determined to pursue justice on behalf of their dead relatives.
Imagine the state of the families of the dead. We will not keep quiet. We will fight in every way we can. We are the survivors of the dead. Will the mothers like us or the widows keep quiet? We will keep fighting all our lives. We will curse them. We are already dead. Who will kill us? Nobody can keep us quiet. Nobody can keep the truth hidden.
The gas turned them into a death trap.
What happened here on that December night in 1984 gave the world a name that will forever be linked to the world's worst chemical disaster, Bhopal.
How people proved and showed their resilience has moved me most. There have been instances where people were trying to protect their lives. They forgot their children sleeping in the house and they ran away to protect their lives. But what has moved me most is the resilience and the prowess of the city to pull their threads and rebuild their lives. And that is, I think, a lesson for everybody.
As well as the terrible physical costs, the horrifying images of that night are seared into the minds of all who saw them.
It was for the first time that I witnessed such a ghastly tragedy, all happening in front of my eyes. And I really thank God that all my family members were safe, But then again, when I saw the people around me, that was something which I'd never forget, something which should never have happened.
But happen it did. A tragedy for Bhopal, a lesson for the world.